Hey everyone, my name is Bonus and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be having a look at the Draconic options on Unearthed Arcana from Wizards of the Coast. We're going to be seeing whether Dragonborn have had a buff or a nerf with the different sub-races that they've got out, whether Kobold is more of a viable option for player characters now, and finally, whether they have tried to sneak a shard mine from 4E into 5th edition. I'm really excited to see all the things we've got coming up, so stay tuned.
Well, hello there. Oh, how delightful.
So it's really cool to see more Dragonborn options in 5e in this Unearthed Arcana. I think Dragonborns in the Player's Handbook got a bit of an undersell beforehand. Dragonborn actually had about a sixth worth of their entry into the Player's Handbook actually taken up by descriptions of other races and even just, a very specific Dragonlance evil version of Dragonborn. So it's really cool to see Dragonborn get a very specific centered focus here. The other amazing thing about this Unearthed Arcana is that it's not only Dragonborn that we get a look at, it's also Kobold, and I think maybe they found a way to sneak in a shard mine into this whole thing. And there's also the feats and the spells, and we're going to get stuck into all of that right now. So first off, they're calling this Draconic races instead of Dragonborn or Kobold, so it feels like you can almost play any race with this Draconic ancestry sort of weave through. As we can see here, they talk about 3 varying Dragonborn races, but they also say that when you're making a new character using one of these races, it is one way to reflect a character with dragons somewhere far back in their ancestry. So when creating your character, we have the standard same things that we always do here. We have the ability score increases. I like to see that they've carried on the same thing from Tasha's, where it is a case of really being able to choose whichever ability score increase you'd like to. Next, we've got a customization of languages, and as you can see, it really is up to the player and the DM to kind of work out what languages would be appropriate for their character. And then the next section we have here is the creature type, and I find this interesting because it explains all the different creature types that there are in Dungeons and Dragons, but I feel like it almost is hinting at the fact that you can choose more than just humanoid for your player race here, that you can choose whichever kind of creature type you want to that fits your character. Yet actually when we have a look at the actual options, you'll see that they do in fact call them all humanoid. So I'm not really sure if they are going for a versatility here and saying you can actually choose whichever type you want, or whether they are just saying, okay, actually they're going to be humanoid, but here are the other creature types and this is what a creature type is. Maybe they're just giving some definition for newer players who aren't so sure about the creature type definitions. It's weird that they have this here though. I'm wondering if they're trying to go for versatility or not. I like to think that they are, however, and I would say that if you are going to play a Draconic option here, a Draconic race that isn't Dragonborn, but you want to play maybe a Draconic, themed Centaur, for example, you can still have that Fey type, creature type reference instead of the humanoid. I think this is a really cool way for players to get as much flavour and as much creativity and versatility into their player characters. So the first thing that really stands out here is we have a massive difference between Chromatic Dragons and Metallic Dragons in this version. In the Player's Handbook, they were all referenced, but really the benefits you got from either were actually the same. The only thing that changed was basically the dragon type. That was more based on the colour and not necessarily whether you were a Chromatic Dragonborn or a Metallic Dragonborn. I like to see here, however, that there are much more variable differences between the two. One thing I do want to point out, however, before we get really stuck into this, is that now, all of a sudden, Chromatic Dragonborn are the only ones that get access to the poison type here. If you want a specific poison type, resistance, or damage type, then green and Chromatic Dragonborn are going to be your only option here going forward. I think that's something just to keep in mind, because beforehand you were still Dragonborn through and through, they didn't have the sub-races. Now, all of a sudden, it matters. So let's get stuck into the Chromatic Dragonborn traits first. And as we can see here, we have the same types that we do in the Player's Handbook. We've got black for acid, blue for lightning, green for poison, red for fire, and white for cold. So as we can see, the creature type here is humanoid, which is unchanged. The size is medium and the speed is the same as it was before. So those things are unchanged. However, I do like, again, to think that the creature type could be anything. You don't maybe have to be humanoid if you're going for more of a dragon themed race instead of just a Dragonborn. Now, right out of the gate here, we have a breath weapon, which is actually amazing. The changes they've made to this are mind-blowing. Instead of 2d6 worth of damage, which is what you got from the player's handbook, you got 2d8, which is a really nice buff. But on top of that, the main buff here is you can use your breath weapon now as an attack, as part, of an attack. So you can use it if you have 2 attacks in your attack action, you can use one of those attacks as your breath weapon. So this is a direct buff, especially to martial classes. The other thing you get from this is it's not just a one-use only thing. You also get the ability to use these breath weapons multiple times, equal in fact to your proficiency once per long rest. This is a fantastic way to give players more versatility and more options. Beforehand, with these breath weapon attacks, you'd often see them open up the start of a fight when enemies are grouped to try and get as many enemies as you can without affecting your allies, or you'd see them at the very end of combat, what with them giving half damage even on a failed save, just to guarantee some damage on the enemy, just to try and make sure that you kill it dead. Now, I think with the multiple uses that we've got and the buff in damage, we're going to see it happen more often throughout combat. We're going to see players use these when they actually need them, not just at the start or the end of combat. So I'm really excited to see that. Now, just as before, we also have the Draconic resistance here for Chromatic Dragonborn. That's nice to see. That's unchanged resistant to the type of damage that is linked to your Draconic ancestry. That's lovely to see. But the crazy thing we've got here is chromatic warding. And I want to say this now. I think the Chromatic Dragonborn is specifically focused on frontline fighters, and here's why. Starting at 3rd level, as an action, you can channel your Draconic energies to protect yourself. For 10 minutes, you become immune to the damage type linked to your ancestry. 10 minutes is a huge amount here. We have 10 minutes of pure immunity. This is really cool to see as an option for a race. You can absolutely be the center focus now of a very specific type of adventure. That's really, really fun to see, to give players that sort of spotlight just from their character options. On top of that as well, though, I think that it really gives GMs a chance to try and give some versatility and change to the kind of encounters they're going to have in an expected area. Maybe you go into a volcano and there are lots of fire type creatures, but also maybe you have like one ice type or one, necrotic type creature, something that you wouldn't expect otherwise. It gives GMs a chance to pause and think, okay, I've got this player who could have immunity to all of this damage. I need to think of a way to maybe change things up ever so slightly to give them a bit of a risk to going into this volcano still, but still reward them for having that creature type. And as well, 10 minutes is a huge amount of time to be delving into something and getting that immunity. That is an entire adventure almost, depending on what you're doing. This is a cave system that you're going through. This is a ruin, a dungeon, not just one encounter. So it's really cool to see 10 minutes worth here. I think this is really going to change how some encounters are run. I personally think that the Chromatic Dragonborn is specifically skewed to frontline fighters, however, for 2 main reasons. The first reason is, as we said, this chromatic warding giving a specific immunity. If you're at the back and you're doing range damage, this is still a nice option to have, but I feel like those of you who are at the back playing your characters as ranged usually aren't going to benefit from this as much as a frontline fighter, because usually it's the frontline fighters who are receiving the most damage. You're up in the enemy's faces, they want to get you out of the way, they want to get around you to try and focus on your ranged allies. This is going to be definitely for frontline fighters here. The second reason I think this is to do with a melee frontline fighter is now Chromatic Dragonborn have exclusivity to that 5 foot wide, 30 foot long breath weapon. In the player's handbook, we saw this 5 foot wide, 30 foot long breath weapon to black, blue, brass, bronze, and copper Dragonborn, whereas now we see it specifically for Chromatic Ancestry Dragonborn. And I think this is a really unique change here, because I feel like it again focuses on it being a frontline fighter, because as somebody who is frontline, you maybe don't have that many ranged options, and all of a sudden having something that is 30 foot long that is potentially going to get more enemies than just one is a really good option to have. I see this for the frontline fighter who's doing lots of damage. I don't see this as much for a ranged character. I think it's still viable for a ranged character, absolutely, but this is definitely an option for a frontline character, I feel. So next up we have the Metallic Dragonborn characters here, And we have brass for fire type, we have bronze for lightning type damage, we have copper for acid type damage, we have gold for fire again, and silver for cold. Now again, you get this breath weapon which replaces one of your attacks in your attack action. Again, it is 2d8 worth of damage, which is a direct 2 before. Also, it is the same calculation as before in both cases, whereas a DC equal to 8 plus your con modifier and your proficiency. The difference here, however, when compared to the Chromatic type Dragonborn, is that this is in a 15-foot cone. So this is much more about an area of effect damage rather than the single line focus. Also, the range is only 15 feet instead of it being a 30-foot line. So this again focuses on more of a spread rather than a direct line of fire. The second thing to look at here is the metallic breath weapon. So this actually is a Dragonborn that has 2 types of breath weapon here, which is really strange as a choice, just off the hat, but let's have a look and see what it does. So at 3rd level, you get yet another 15-foot cone breath weapon, and yet again, you are using this in place of one of your attack actions. However, instead of it doing a damage type here, we see instead this is more of an effect that it gives. You can either choose to push enemies in that 15-foot cone 20 feet away from you, or incapacitate them. And incapacitated means that they don't get an attack or reaction that turn. Finally, this is once per long rest, so we don't get to use it as many times as the other breath weapon, but it's still nice to have an option like this. Now, of course, this is against your saving throw, and also needs that con modifier to be relatively high for it to be viable, especially early game. Later on, as your proficiency bonus gets up, you'll still have this anyway, but right at the start, it needs to have quite a good con modifier. I think it needing a constitution modifier, however, doesn't go against the idea that I believe the Metallic Dragonborn traits are specifically for ranged player characters here. I think they are for people who maybe are more a spellcaster type than they are for melee frontline fighters, and here's why. First off, I think if you are a spellcaster type, you have lots of things that have range anyway, but you probably won't have that many options for when you are fighting off enemies that are very close to you. And especially something that a caster has that is really important is concentration. And if you have lots of enemies fighting you, those are going to be many attacks against you that are going to maybe potentially have you lose your concentration. Having something that is a 15-foot attack area cone is going to mean that you can fight multiple enemies at once with a breath weapon and potentially even push them away or incapacitate them and stop those multitudes of enemies fighting you, and you are going to be able to move away and get that range either by killing with a breath weapon or pushing them away or incapacitating them. I think this is very focused on getting enemies away from you, damaging enemies around you, and I think it is more for a range type player character here. I'm not sure whether having a second breath type weapon is exactly the feel that I'd go for here. I do feel overall this is a bit of a weaker option than the Chromatic Dragonborn type. However, I think it's at least a good option, and it is definitely something to consider. I think if you are a very specific type of range caster, this is actually probably one of the stronger race options out there for you. So really cool to see this. I'm really interested to see what kind of characters you think you could make up with this type of race option. What kind of ranged spellcasters could you use for the Metallic Dragonborn option? Give me an idea in the comments below. So next I want to have a look at one of the most unique options that this Unearthed Arcana has brought out, and that is Gem Dragonborn. So yet again with these Dragonborn traits, you are a humanoid who is medium sized and have a walking speed of 30 feet. But the crazy change here is that your Draconic ancestry is now to do with dragons that are specifically linked to gems. With this gem ancestry, you can have a dragon that is amethyst themed and therefore has resistance to force damage. Crystal has resistance to radiant damage. Emerald has the damage type of psychic. Sapphire has the damage type of thunder, and Topaz has the damage type of necrotic. Now, much like the Metallic Dragonborn again, this Gem Dragonborn has a breath weapon that replaces one of the attacks in your attack action and does 2d8 worth of damage here in a 15-foot cone. Again, you can use this breath weapon as many times as you have proficiency per long rest. You have Draconic resistance to the damage type, again based on your ancestry, and these are really interesting here because these are damage types that are much harder to counter usually. I feel like there are more options to counter the more elemental damage types than there are to counter things like Radiant, Psychic, Thunder and Necrotic. I definitely don't see that many Thunder resistances. I think this is really cool because oftentimes when these damage types do come up, you are against monsters that are very powerful, and I think that's the trade-off for having them come up less frequently. When you are playing one of the other Dragonborn types, I feel like you are getting options that give you resistances to creatures you will find more often, and therefore your resistance will come up more. But I think that when you need the resistance the most, it's possibly against creatures that are going to be using these damage types. I mean, when you come up against creatures that are doing necrotic type damage, oftentimes that they put out a huge amount of damage. So seeing options that give resistance to those types of creatures, those big bad enemies, I think is really cool to see. And here we begin to see the really unique options that this Gem Dragonborn brings to the table for a player character. We have this psionic mind, which allows you to telepathically speak to any creature you can see within 30 feet of you. Now, they can't reply, but it still has that kind of flavor that they are leaning into at the moment with psionics. We saw psionics with Tasha's, and we're now seeing it again with this Unearthed Arcana. Secondly, with this Dragonborn type, we have the Gem Flight option here starting at 3rd level, and this allows you to have gems appear around you, turn into wings, and then be able to turn your walking speed into a flying speed for 1 minute. Not only this, but you can stay airborne whilst using this because you can hover, and you get to use this once per long rest. And this is a really nice option, again, I think, for ranged type characters. Not often will you be melee and need to fly around whilst you attack things unless your enemies are directly flying themselves, but then you probably have more issues than just the fact that you can't reach them when you're melee anyway. Most of your party aren't all going to be, you know, Gem Dragonborn and able to fly around for that 1 minute. And if you are fighting against flying type things, it's probably that more encounters in the adventure that you're doing rather than just the one are going to have those flying type creatures. So something lasting a minute and giving you flying then isn't going to help you too much. I really do think this is another ranged class option here. Now, this is where I believe they are bringing in Shard Mind from 4th edition into 5th edition here, and I'll tell you why I think this right now. So, Shard Minds are creatures that have this sort of crystalline structure to them. They are kind of a cross between a Dragonborn and a Warforged. I feel if a Warforged had the sort of look of a Dragonborn but was made out of gems, I think that would make a very Shard Mind looking character. Now, Shard Minds had resistance to psychic damage, which we can see that the Emerald Dragon type here has resistance to. They also were able to speak telepathically to creatures, and we can see this here as well. And finally, they were able to split themselves off into lots of smaller gems, swirl around enemies, causing enemies to give them combat advantage, which was basically a +2 to attacks against those enemies. And then Shard Minds were able to teleport themselves out of that situation. And I feel, especially with the feat that we're going to look at later for these guys, that Gem Dragonborn are a specific reference to Shard Mind. I am really excited to see a Shard Mind themed race in 5e. I think they were a really cool and unique form of player character option in 4th edition, and it's nice to see them get some sort of representation here. Even though it's not in name explicitly, I do feel this is what they were going for with this kind of character. Overall, however, I do think actually the Gem Dragonborn are possibly one of the weakest out of the bunch, just because the Gem Flight, I think, has the fewest applications. It might be nice early on, but I do feel like it doesn't allow higher level characters to get the same oomph that they would compared to the other type of Dragonborn options here. I think 1 minute of flight, especially at high levels, when you have possibly magic items that do this for you and for longer periods, isn't as good as maybe a breath weapon that can push enemies away, or immunity to a certain type of damage for 10 minutes. I think the other ones are just vastly stronger than this character option is here. However, in very specific cases, races, I do see these unique and often overlooked damage types being very, very important, and actually for certain campaigns making this type of Draconic race option be way more viable than the other two. As a final thought for all the Dragonborn options, I will say it is a bit of a shame that not all Dragonborn sub-races here got the ability to fly in some way. I do often think, of flight when I think of a dragon, and so for only the Gem Dragonborn, which is possibly the least organic of them all, to have the flight option is a bit strange here. It would be nice to eventually see characters with this option all get the flight ability, and maybe this is something that they can look into with feats or other changes in the future. And finally, from the race options, we have the Kobold here. Now, I really like what the Kobold can bring to a table for a party of characters. I think it's a really unique character option. However, I want to preface this by saying I don't think that this Kobold option is really the kind of Kobold that I would want to play personally. So focusing on the Kobold traits here, we have them being humanoid, they are small, and their walking speed is 30 feet. Now it's really cool to see a small race option here with that general walking speed. Usually small races have their walking speed reduced to 25 feet, so it's nice to see that change in option here. On top of that, we have this dark vision that goes out to 60 feet, and we no longer have this sunlight sensitivity that we saw in Volo's guide, so it's nice to see this being more of a viable option for player characters in any campaign, whereas in Volo's guide I feel like it was very specific to them being in the Underdark. Something that we see as a continuation on from the other options here is that these Kobold also get the +2 in 1 stat, or the +1 in 1 attribute, or +1 in 3 attributes here. In Volo's, they kind of had this weird nerf where they got a +2 in strength, but a reduction of 2 in dexterity. So this is a much better version of that, specifically for a player character. However, it's when we look at the Draconic legacy for a Kobold that I begin to feel they move away from what it is to be a Kobold, and they move into more of a strange other type of creature that I'm not so sure fits in with the Kobold themes we've seen throughout 5e so far. So when we look at this Draconic legacy for a Kobold, you get to choose one of 3 options at character creation. You can have advantage on saving throws against the frightened condition, you can choose a cantrip from the sorcerer list, or you can make an unarmed strike with your tail. Now with this Draconic legacy alone, I find this a really strange option here because none of these feel inherently Kobold. I'd say that the advantage to the frightened condition feels more like a halfling thing, and I think halflings are already underrated. To see this in a Kobold is strange to me because I've always seen them actually be quite scared creatures unless they are in large numbers. I'd like to see that, idea of them being part of a bigger group referenced here, rather than them having a natural advantage to being frightened. I also think that it's strange that they get a cantrip. Why they are inherently magical, I'm not so sure. Now I know they are linked to dragons and they are underlings of dragons, but in the monster manual we never see them have this strange, innate magic to them. And it's also something we don't see in Volo's guide, so why all of a sudden they get it here, I'm not so sure. And with the unarmed strike here with your tail, I don't see this being really a keen option for Kobold. Now the fact that it's based on strength and that it doesn't really do anything more, doesn't knock anyone down, it just feels kind of like a bum option here. I feel like that there are other potentially better races for characters that would want something like this, like lizard folk for example. They get to use their bite attack, and also they get a special type of bite attack, whereas this feels like you're just giving yourself an unarmed strike with a tail that does 1d6 damage. I'm not sure where that would be viable on a character that you can't find better sources for this elsewhere. Kobold usually fight with spears or slings, and using their tail again feels like they are putting their sort of small physicality in harm's way, and that doesn't feel like a very Kobold thing for me. The biggest problem I have here though is the Draconic Roar. Now as a bonus action you can use your roar to scare enemies within 10 feet of you. Now in Volo's guide you were able to grovel as an action and give your allies advantage against the enemies around you within 10 feet. And that was really Kobold themed, because Kobolds have this kind of pack mentality. In fact, Kobolds actually in Valos also had pack tactics that gave them advantage to attack rolls when an ally was within 5 feet of the enemy. Now with Draconic Roar, you don't actually get pack tactics anymore, and instead all of a sudden this Kobold is able to make this massive Draconic Roar, even though they are supposed to be sort of these scared, creatures that work best in groups. I don't think this is very themed here. Also, why a Kobold is able to make this Draconic Roar when a normal Dragonborn isn't? They aren't able to have this sort of scream that allows them to give advantage to their allies. It seems like this Kobold is a very different take on what we've seen so far, and I don't think if you want to play a Kobold character that is themed around the Kobold race, that this is really a good option for you. Now I know player characters are often protagonists and are very different to the race that they come from, but I feel like if you're going to play a Kobold, you want it to at least feel like you're tapping into that Kobold group mentality, and I don't think that this race really gives that here. So before we go on to the feats and spells in this Unearthed Arcana, if you like this video so far, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up. And also, if you want to subscribe to this channel, you can get more content like this every week, tips and tricks for players. And also please consider having a look at the links below where you can get lots of free advice and maps, and come along and join our Discord and help grow this community. I'm really excited to see how well we're doing so far, and I'd love to have you along as well. So next, let's have a look at the feats that they are offering us in this Unearthed Arcana. So first off, we have the Gift of the Chromatic Dragon, which again feels very, very much like it is themed specifically for people who are in melee in front line. So first off, as a bonus action, you can touch your weapon and infuse it with a special type of damage, and you can do this once per long rest. That feels really cool. And secondly, you also get the ability to, when you take a damage of a certain type, the triggering damage you gain resistance to, and you can use this a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus per long rest. Now this really reminds me of a Blade Singer that is taking the Absorb Elements spell. This probably allows somebody to have those abilities without taking that spell potentially, or take that spell and then have something to fall back on if they need to. Also, the 1d4 extra type of damage really fits in with that melee attacker, elemental warrior type theme that this Chromatic Dragonborn seems to be focusing on. Personally, I really would like to see this on my character, who is a warlock / wildfire druid who uses a lot of fire themed in their abilities, and maybe I'd like to see them take this kind of feat, because then they can put out even more damage there, and also get resistance to a certain type as well. Now take note here that this isn't specifically tied to the type of Dragonborn that you are. It allows you to take any damage type from the Chromatic Dragon and also resist any damage type from the Chromatic Dragon. Now this is really cool because it also proves that these aren't specifically for Dragonborn characters. These feats are for anyone who has maybe a bit of Draconic ancestry in their background. I'm really excited to see options like this for players. This makes it so versatile, and I can see feats being used like this for multiple types of characters and not just Dragonborn. Really excited for these. Next, we have the Gift of the Metallic Dragon. Here you are able to use the Cure Wounds spell once per long rest, and also it doesn't count against the amount of spells that you know, and you're able to use it with the spell slots that you have if you're a caster. Furthermore, you can choose the spell casting ability that this is based on. This is such a nice way that they are doing this. Usually when you get a kind of feat like this, it is based on a very specific type of mental stat. I really like to see that they are allowing you to choose which type of stat you are using to have Cure Wounds with. All of a sudden as well, this opens up Cure Wounds and healing spells for characters that wouldn't normally get access to them. But on top of that, I can see this being really useful for characters that do want healing magic but are already casters, because now you get to have the Cure Wounds spell without it counting against your spells known, and still using your spell slots if you want to. The really cool part of the Gift of the Metallic Dragon that I like though is this ability to protect allies within within 5 feet of you. Having this ability to react against an attack within 5 feet of you and grant your ally or yourself a D4 bonus to your AC is so strong. Again, I think this really works for more of a ranged type character that wants to protect themselves, but it is also nice to see a feat that is based on the Metallic Dragon that would be really good for a frontline fighter again here, protecting others and also getting a Cure Wounds spell, which is a touch type spell. I think this really lends itself to either type of player character. A very thematic themed feat and one that I really am excited to see. What kind of character would you see this on for yourself? Would you see this only on a character that already has a kind of healing protective type of magic, or would you see this as an option for really a character that wouldn't have this otherwise? Is this a neat way to allow characters like a rogue, for example, that would never have a type of healing to all of a sudden get that? And because rogues attack in melee, able to give them a way to protect themselves or their ally who's next to them, giving them the sneak attack option. I can see this being really cool for those kinds of characters here. And as the final feat out of the 3 that we have here, we have Gift of the Gem Dragon. Now this, I feel, is the most powerful out of all of them. It's a really strong feat, and let's see why. So we are able to increase our intelligence, our wisdom or our charisma score by 1 here. That is already in itself a really nice feat to have, just to bump up that 1 odd stat to an even, so you get the difference in modifiers. Also, now when you take damage from a creature within 10 feet of you, you can use your reaction to have this burst of telekinetic energy that not only damages them but also pushes them 10 feet away. And on top of this, you can use this as your reaction a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus once per long rest. Having this ability to sonically repel people that are close to you 3, 4, 5 times based on your level, based on your proficiency bonus, is a huge boon, and doing damage to them as well is such a fantastic way to counter attackers that are in melee against you. All of a sudden, if an enemy comes up to you and uses their entire movement to attack you, their first attack you can repel them away, and now if they have the multi-attack option, they can't use that against you because you've pushed them 10 feet away if they fail that saving throw. And then doing damage on top of that is just so strong, and the fact that it is force damage is crazy because so few monsters resist that type of damage. Really cool to see this type of feat here, especially because it is not specifically for Dragonborn characters only. I'm really excited to see the kind of characters that could use this. Would you use this on your character? I don't see why not. Let me know in the comments below. And finally, in this Unearthed Arcana, we have the spells. Now, I want to point out straight away that I do think that these spells are a little too restricted by the type of class that you're going to be playing. As we can see here, it is mainly for sorcerers and wizards that these spells are focused on, and I can understand why they've done that, but I do think it's a bit of a sad option considering the variety we have with druids now, the variety of warlocks we have, that those classes don't get more access to these spells. I find it strange that, for example, an arcane trickster would have more options here than a warlock or a druid would, when druids specifically are very much themed around the elements, and these spells seem to be, again, very much themed around elements and protected magic, which I feel like is a druid thing. And also with the warlock options that we'd had, when you can have your patron be almost anything now, I find it strange that they don't have these spells available to warlocks when their patron could very feasibly fit into the theme of these spells. So first off, we have Draconic Transformation here. Basically allows you to change into a dragon. You have blind sight up to a range of 30 feet, you have a flying speed of 40 feet, and when you cast a spell as a bonus action, you can breathe out fire that does 3d8 force damage. I think it's the 7th level spell, it needing concentration is a bit of a whiff. I think that at 7th level there are probably better spells that will need your concentration, but the fact that it is a bonus action is really nice. Secondly, we have Fizban's Platinum Shield. That is a 6th level abjuration spell. Now, it's always nice to see abjuration spells because I don't think we have enough of them in 5e, so abjuration wizards always seem to feel a bit lackluster because of that. and having the ability to shield an ally from certain type of attacks. They gain resistance to acid, cold, fire, lightning and poison damage. They now gain half cover, and also whenever they have to make a dexterity saving throw, they either take half damage on a failed dexterity save or no damage at all on a successful one. This is a really nice way for you to protect your allies in combat. I absolutely can understand why this is 6th level, and I can absolutely understand why this is concentration up to 1 minute. I really like what they've done here, and I think this is a really cool spell to have at higher levels. Now we come on to probably one of my favorite spells. I think this is probably one of the best spells in this as well, so really excited to see Flame Stride here. Now with Flame Stride, you are able to increase your speed by setting your feet on fire by 20 feet, and also you are able to not provoke opportunity attacks. I think this is such a cool option again for a melee fighter, but on top of that you are also setting fire to objects that aren't one or being carried within 5 feet of you, and a creature that is within 5 feet of you that you move past is also going to take 1d6 fire damage. With that increased speed and also the ability not to take opportunity attacks, I can see somebody who has a lot of speed and is also a frontline fighter taking this kind of spell. Like a Blade Sling with this would be able to run rings around the enemies, do 1d6 damage to them all, and still be able to push in a lot of attacks with their either cantrips or their melee attacks. I really like this option here. This is such a cool spell for a Blade Singer. Now again, I would have really liked to see this for a Warlock or a Druid who is more of a melee type caster. I think again, it being flame is really, you know, thematic, especially again for a Wildfire Druid, you know, having their footsteps cause fire to sprout out from the ground, I think is a really cool option. It's a shame that it isn't for them, and I think in my campaigns I'd probably, you know, think about allowing this for those kinds of characters, but still a really cool spell. Now, another one of my favorite spells here that I maybe think could have done with a bit of a better name. I don't know who Icing Death is, but still, and this is a cool spell to see. So Icing Death's Frost, see, it's actually hard for me to say. Icing Death's Frost here we have is a 2nd level spell, so it's quite a low level spell, especially when we see what it does. So here there is a bit of a confusion whether it is a 15-foot cone or a 30-foot cone. I think it being a 30-foot cone would be too strong, but it is a cone attack that does cold damage, 3d8 cold damage, which is really high for a 2nd level spell, that can last for a minute on a creature if that creature fails its saving throw. Now, if that creature fails its saving throw and is encased in ice, it also has its speed reduced to 0. So not only is it taking 3d8, it is then reduced to 0 speed. On top of that, it then needs to use its action to actually break out of that ice if it wants to stop its speed being reduced. This is such a powerful spell and really, really nice for those casters who want to again get out of combat. Almost you could take this breath weapon attack, this spell on any character, and kind of have yourself covered by the things that the Metallic Dragonborn gives you as a character option for your race. So this kind of almost feels like it takes away from those character options. I don't really see a character wanting those character options and this spell as well. I feel that would be overkill, but it's really nice to see as a spell for any type of caster here. And then we probably come on to my least favorite spell of the lot. Nathir's Mischief kind of is a bag of tricks that you roll randomly and it has some sort of effect, mostly dealing with the kind of, you know, psychic trickery realm of spells that we can see a lot of characters use here. And again, this not being an option for a cleric, I don't understand, and the trickery domain cleric would absolutely fit into this, but yeah, it's not even an option for clerics, so that's a bit of a shame. But at least it being a bard type spell, I can see this being kind of thematic for them. I do think though, if you are playing a serious type of campaign, you're not really going to get much of a flavor for this, but anyway, let's see what it does. So with this spell, you create a 20-foot cube that has the following effects in it. Either you can create the smell of apple pie, which is going to charm creatures in that area, a bouquet of flowers, which is going to blind creatures in that area, a ability to make characters giggle in the area and cause them to be incapacitated, or molasses to appear, making the area difficult terrain. Now, these are all really cool options, but the difference in what they do and the variety and it being random makes me feel like I'd rather take other 2nd level spells than this, unless I was going for specifically a very chaotic trickery sort of random themed character. I think you have to take a very certain type of character to use this, and I feel like this would fit very well with a wild mage sorcerer than it would for anything else really. The penultimate spell that we have is Raulothim's Psychic Lance, which is a 4th level enchantment that does an insane amount of damage. All of a sudden you are able to unleash a lance of psychic energy from your forehead, and then you are able to attack a creature in range, and if you know their name, they don't even get cover from this attack. That is just such a cool thematic theme in and of itself. I love the flavor of this spell. On top of that, this lance targets creatures with an intelligence saving throw that they need to make, which is usually the weakest thing, and then it does, and this is crazy, 10d6 worth of damage. Now I can absolutely understand why this is not an attack roll and that this has to be a saving throw, because imagine if that crit. Now the fact that if you know its name gives you the ability to cast it on them, whether or not they have cover over them or whether they are invisible, allows you to not need to see this creature in range. That is such a cool thing. Really like this spell, really like the theme, and it's a huge amount of damage for a 4th level spell. Absolutely love this. And finally we have Summon Draconic Spirit. Now this is possibly one of my favorite ones as well, just because the idea of summoning a dragon is super cool. Even the object that you need for it is something from a dragon's hoard, specifically worth 500 gold pieces. I love the theme and flavor of that. One of my favorite spells that came out from Tasha's was the ability to summon a bestial spirit, and this is very much in the flavor of that. Now overall, people I think at first glance would think that this isn't strong enough as a spell for 5th level. I think when you look at the attacks and you see that it only does 1d6 plus 4 damage plus the spell's level in piercing damage, it doesn't come across that well. But then you realize that it can also do 2 of those attacks each turn and a breath weapon. That is a lot of damage that it is putting out here. And again, if you are fighting against something that is using concentration, the more sources of damage that you can put out against those creatures is really cool. On top of that, you have something that is going to be able to fly around, that has resistances to certain types of damage, that gives you the ability to have something that can see, you know, in the dark for 60 feet, has blind sight for 30 feet, and also even able to, you know, understand Draconic if you need to. It's a really useful utility to have this kind of creature going around, because I feel like even, you know, not from the damage alone, but its actual abilities as a scout could come in really clutch here. Really nice spell, really enjoy the fact that this is an option. I'm not so sure about it being concentration, as I wasn't so sure with the bestial spirit either, but I think in both cases that is the payoff for such a powerful spell, and I can see why they've done that here. So those are my thoughts on the Unearthed Arcana for this week. I think it's really, really cool overall to see so many options, and I think the spells and feats especially are some really nice options for all characters to have access to. I do think that the options do need to be a bit refined. I do think that some are a bit too powerful and some are not powerful enough, but overall a really good Unearthed Arcana from Wizards of the Coast here. And I'd love to know, what do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Do you think that these need to be buffed or nerfed even more? Do you like any of the spells specifically? And what do you think about these feats being available to all characters, not only the ones that have the Dragonborn race background? If you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you want more videos like this, consider subscribing and joining the community. And if you want to know every single time I upload a new video, consider turning on those bell notifications. Aside from that, thank you very much for watching. You can see more of my videos right here. This is one about PvP and how to use it in your games. And yeah, I really look forward to making more videos like this. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.